Hello, I'm Mark Bremer, and in this edition of Dark Arts, we're going to deal with a fairly complex but very frequently requested tutorial on how to add roads to terrains. Carrara has a great ability to add some incredible terrains and then populate it very easily with all sorts of vegetation and anything else you might want to put onto it. But when it comes down to actually adding things like terrains, or not terrains but roads to the terrains, it becomes more of a problem because of the way Carrara is designed to handle terrains. So like all of the Dark Arts tutorials, these are advanced tutorials, so I don't spend time going over some of the basic features of the program sets. We go right into the deep stuff, and I am also using 2 additional pieces of software to make this process easier. I'll be using Adobe Photoshop. This one happens to be CS3, and Adobe Illustrator as well, and you can use some other programs by Carrara or others to imitate some of the features you'll see me using right here. Well, let's hop into Carrara and create a new scene. Scale is a big part of your landscapes, and typically if I'm going to be adding people to a landscape, I will use the large scale. In my setup, especially US standard, the large scale, the modeling box size is 3,000 feet. For this demonstration, I'm simply going to stay with medium scale, which is 30 feet. I'll select empty scene, and immediately we get a new room, and I'm simply going to insert a terrain into this. It pops in there, and we are popped into the terrain modeling room. I'll go ahead and move these around just a little bit. The features we'll be looking at use the full screen capability. I have, like you probably do, some larger monitors than what I'm recording this in, but it's so that we can keep it into a manageable size. How we go through these steps is very important because creating roads on terrains is a little bit of a one-way trip. Once you get everything set up and go through the process, you don't have the luxury of changing things later on. So you need to make sure that your terrain is exactly the way you want it prior to getting into adding road features. Some of these things are adding different filters. It always opens up with the default mountain filter. I'm actually going to change that to a valley and mountain simply because it has a little more character and personality to it. We can keep changing it. We can keep adding different filters, erosion filters if we wanted. For this demonstration, I won't do that. We'll hop directly into creating a road and then how we create specialized textures for it and then apply that back into Carrara's texture room. So let's assume we added different filters or not in this case. The first step we take is coming over here to the left side of the terrain modeling window where we've got a large button that says Map Editor. I'm going to click this and we get a little modal dialog box that pops up that says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Because once you say OK, all your specialty filters that we've put in here are going to be converted into a black and white, or I should say a grayscale image map to create the terrain. In this case, yes, we do. But this is one of the cautions about this process. We are going to export this grayscale map so we can do a little funny business on it in Photoshop. And then we're going to re-import it back into Carrara. One thing that's important is that during this process, you don't want to actually close this window. The reason for that is that if it's closed and then you reopen it, Carrara kind of stops using some of the mathematical tricks that it does to hide how terrains are created, and it converts this into a 256 grayscale image, which winds up with some real obvious terracing or stair-stepping to your terrain that we don't want. We've got a black and white scale map here. We know that white is high, black is low, so we've got a valley and a peak. But I want to increase the image map size to something that is not going to show all the polygons when we're working with it. At a minimum, it should be a 1025 by 1025 pixel grayscale map. Typically, I'll go ahead and double that or even take it all the way up to nearly 5,000. For the sake of this demonstration, I'll just leave it at 1025 by 1025, which means that now we can scroll through it. Now you know from working with Carrara that it's got its own set of painting tools. We could paint a road onto our terrain map here, and it would show up. on the map. The problem is it's a very simple way to do it, and it leads to some very simplistic and really undesirable looking types of results. So what we'll want to do now that we've increased the scale of this map to 1025 by 1025, we're now going to export this map so we can do some specialty type of work on it in Photoshop. I'll select export. It says where do you want to go. I created a special folder called Mountain Road, and I'll save this into it, but I'm going to save it as a Photoshop file, and then let's name it something meaningful like exported terrain, and choose OK. Now I'm going to leave this box open, but I am now going to open that Photoshop document. So Photoshop loads up. I'm hiding some of my palettes because I've got such a little area to work in. The map opens up at its full 1025 by 1025. I'm going to need to shrink this to fit it into our screen here so we can work with it. And then let me go ahead and use the magnifying tool and zoom down. Same exact map. White is high, dark is low. Well, here's some of the specialty tools we'll be using in Photoshop to create our roads. Some roads you could make go over a high point and then down into a valley and a straight road. You know, that's okay, but it's also usually highly unbelievable, and it's prone with problems when you want to make it look like it's believably integrated into the terrain. So here's how we get around that. I'm going to switch to my magic wand tool. I've set the default setting from the normal 32 to a tolerance of 2. This means it isn't going to select much. Most roads, actually, as it goes through mountainous terrains, don't go up and down. They'll typically more closely follow the actual contours of the terrain it's on, and that's why I'm using the magnifying glass. So I'm just going to click a couple spots. I see a selection. Maybe that's a little bit better. Let's work with this one. Now I'm not going to fill this with anything, and this is not going to become my road, but it's going to become a method by which we create our roads. A couple steps we need to do here to be careful. The first one is to duplicate our background, so I'll drag that onto the layer palette. So now we've got a copy that we'll be working on. And I'm also going to create a new layer that I'm simply going to name Road. Now that we've made the selection, the next step in this process is coming over to the Paths palette, opening it, and with the selection active, we've got the ability with one of the little icons down here to convert the selection into an actual drawn path. That's what I'll do now. So now we've got a path. The default name is Work Path. I'm going to double click on that. It changes the name to Path 1, and I'll just leave it with that. There's no real reason not to. The next step is customizing this path so that we can actually use it inside Carrara into something that's going to make some sense for a path. I'll change to my pen tool using the keyboard shortcut P. Then I'll hold down the Apple key. Since I'm on the Macintosh, it would be the Control key on the PC, and I'm going to click this path. You see, and when I click once, the entire path highlights. And what I want to do is delete almost all of this path. So there's a method you need to go through to do this. The first one is wherever the path joins the edge of the texture map, you want to delete that. So I've clicked once there. I'll choose delete, and I'm going to click off of the texture map, and it deselects everything. I'll repeat that same process over here on the left side and click delete. The reason for that is that now when I select the path, even though I'm going to select the far one, the entire path is going to light up. However, when I choose delete, it'll delete that little node, and when I press delete again, it's deleted everything except this path. We've got a couple little extra areas here that I'm going to delete those of, or delete those parts. So now we're left with a single path here. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit, and one of the reasons for that is I'm going to show you a really cool trick using Adobe Illustrator to create believable roads in a snap. But to do that, we need to have a very smooth path set up. So with my pen tool selected, I'm going to make sure that I actually have some smooth curves here. I don't want any of the sharp corners that Photoshop sometimes draws when we're working with the path tool. This will take just a second. We can actually delete some of these if we want, because we're looking for proximity and something that's close to following the terrain, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Here's a perfect example where we get a harsh angle. We don't want that because of the tricks we're going to be pulling with Adobe Illustrator. If you are not going to use Illustrator to create your paths, this becomes a non-issue. You don't need to go through these steps. You can go ahead and jump into the next step, which we're going to do right after I'm done smoothing out all these lines here. So let me go ahead and finish smoothing these. It will take just a second. Thanks so much for your patience. That one looks about right. I'll get some funny ones down here. Let's make these a little more believable. About 3 to go, and then we'll move on to the next stage. Perfect. Now that we've got these paths drawn, I'm going to change from the Path tool to the Brush tool. Keyboard shortcut B. Got a rather large brush drawn here, and I don't know if that's the size I want to actually work with. But you know what? It looks like it may be. The next step then is with the Path palette open. The path selected, I can see the nodes on it. I'm going to come down to the icon here that allows me to stroke the path with the Art tool that's selected. And gosh, that's awful wide, but I think I'm going to go ahead and stay with that. I have black selected right now. I'm going to confirm that I'm on my Layers palette that says Road. I'll come back to my Path palette, and now I will stroke this path with that brush. So we get a black line. We could use this as our road. It would be rather lame looking. That's not what we want to do. What we're going to use this dark line for is a method to select areas on our map to actually create the road we want to take care of. Before we get out of the Path palette here, I'm going to export this path to Illustrator because we're going to do something very special to it once it's in Illustrator. So off the screen here you won't see until I get a little further down is some export options. And one of the export options in Photoshop is to export paths to Illustrator. So I'll do that. It'll say, where do you want to do it? And well, I want it to go right into the mountain road. We'll call this exported road instead of terrain this time. And we'll leave it in the AI format so we can open it in Illustrator. I will deselect the path option here right now so the path goes away, so I won't do anything that I don't want to do to it. And we'll do several things. The first one is I want to create an actual alpha mask of this path area, something that we'll use back in Carrara to create and apply the textures. So I'm going to duplicate this road by dragging it down to the Layers palette. We now have Road Copy. I'm going to go ahead and rename this to Road Alpha just so I can keep the things separated in my fragile little mind. I'm going to Apple click on the Mac, Control click on the PC, and the road gets highlighted. I'm going to invert that selection. And now in the other area where we've inverted the selection to, I'm going to shrink so you can see everything. I'm going to go ahead instead and apply white to that area. This is the opposite of how we would want to use an alpha mask. So I'm actually going to deselect everything and then simply invert that. So now we get something that looks more like an alpha mask. The white is where it shows through. The black is where it does not. We're going to have some kind of chunky edges here a little bit, so what I might actually do is just come up here to blur, do a Gaussian blur of this. Right now it's at 45 pixels. That's way too much. Click my little square in there and just fuzz this up a little bit so it gets a little bit softer. And select OK. I'm going to hide that now. On our original road path, I am now going to go ahead and Apple click or Control click on that to make this a selection, but now I will hide the road. We're going to come down to our background copy layer now, and this is where we start doing some of the funny business in Photoshop to make a road that is level, yet one that follows the terrain that we'll use in Carrara. Here's how we do that. I'm going to blur this selection just a little bit, feather that, use the keyboard shortcut Shift F5, F6 actually on the Macintosh, to go ahead and feather that selection just a little bit. 2 pixels is fine. I'm going to hide the selection so we can't see it. Now the greatest equalizer to make sure, because well let me show you the path again a little bit, that selection. we can see that when we come into these areas, we get these variations within our road, and dark is going to go down. The lighter color is going to go up, and it means our road, frankly, is going to be lumpy. Roads don't look like that. They're smoother, they've been leveled out, they've been graded. Our goal is to make sure that this becomes a level, smooth, graded road. The easiest way for me to do that is to go ahead and invoke one of the first tools of the process, and that is blur. So let's go back up. You can't see it. It's a pull-down menu item from the top of the Photoshop options. Blur, we'll choose Gaussian blur. I really want to blur this up pretty good. I'm going to take this up to something like 45 or 50 where we had it before. We can kind of see it here. I'll hide the selection. And as I push this around a little bit more, you can see in the screen, takes it a while to catch up. Well, that's too much blur. This is so dark now that it's going to be a ditch instead of a road. So we're going to bring it back to about the middle of the road. 41, somewhere in there. If we drag around our little scene here, we can see it update very slightly, and that's perfect. We don't want to have an obvious or significant type of change. I'll select OK. But we're not done yet, because while we have blurred that and evened out the lights and the darks within this selected area, there are still some irregularities that will make the road in Carrara, it looks like it's bulging off of the surface and look weird. So now we'll go ahead and use a seldom used feature in our background area here called High Pass. It's a filter you find under Other. We'll come down to High Pass. And we'll see it shows up here, and it's darkening everything, and in fact it's darkening it just a little too much. So let's reduce that effect. I'll deselect Preview, and gosh, it's really darkening that. Let me come the other direction a little bit. This needs to be a fairly subtle type of change that you want to have. We can see that as we drag through this map. It looks like we're getting a slight darker on one side and lighter on the other. That's actually an optical illusion where the high pass filter is taking the darker areas and it's creating basically what's going to be our smooth road bed that we're going to use. I'm going to go ahead and accept this. We've got a very high value in here of about 160. I may actually increase that just a little bit more and choose OK. This is the basis for our road that we will go ahead and re-import back into Carrara. So at this point, I'll go ahead and export what we have here as exported road. I should say exported. Let's try something like graded road. I'll export it as a TIFF file and collapse the layers on that since we don't need those. I prefer TIFF because when I save it with LZW compression, it's a lossless compression, so I don't get any funky, strange pixelation going on, and choose OK. The next thing we need to actually export is going to be our alpha mask, or what we will use for our alpha mask. We're zoomed in pretty close, almost 300%, and at full resolution here, I can see the pixelation that's going on the edge, which is the reason why I usually work at higher resolutions when I do this type of stuff, but this is a fast way to do it for this one. I will export this now also, but instead I'm going to have exported alpha. We'll also save this as a TIFF file format. My selections are off the screen there, I know that. We won't use layers. I'll select this also and save it with LZW compression. And now we're pretty much done in Photoshop. The next thing I want to do is actually hop over to Adobe Illustrator and show you a way cool trick to create a road. Now, Illustrator opens up, and I need to shrink the screen so you can see what's going on here. We're going to use a very cool feature of Adobe Illustrator called brushes, and it allows you to make some custom brushes. This dark line we see here is the artboard. I am going to hide that because it bothers me right now. So we'll hide the artboard edges. You don't see anything, but in the layers palette on the right here, I'll disclose that, and we get something that's named compound path. I'll select it. It shows up. I'm going to go ahead and stroke it with black simply so we can see it. I'll deselect it now and click off of it. This is the same path that we created in Photoshop. Now, way off to the edges over here in each corner, these little lines that are crop marks, the cool part about exporting a path from Photoshop is that it creates a texture map or a crop size that is identical to the texture map you're working on, which means that when we bring this back into Carrara, it'll be a perfect fit. It's excellent for that. But let me show you the cool little trick we're going to do. We'll create a custom road. I will choose my marquee tool and simply draw actually something a little bit shorter like this. Let me move it down here so it's closer to the road so I can kind of get a little sense of scale. It doesn't have to be exact. For this object, I don't want a line on it. It's a road, for crying out loud. So I'll shift that to a solid. We'll get rid of the stroke that goes around the outside. But no road that I'm aware of is jet black. So let's go ahead and turn this to something more like a middle gray. Now I'm going to draw the lines that indicate the shoulder or edge of the road. To make those painfully obvious, I'm going to color those to be very bright white. I'm going to duplicate this shape and drag it down to the other side of the road. And now I'm going to zoom in just a little bit closer, in fact, and I'm going to draw the middle line, kind of the dashed yellow line that lets us know not to cross lanes and that there's danger and all that good stuff. Let me go ahead and pump up the yellow on that, add a little bit of magenta to it. So there's our center stripe. I'm going to duplicate that to about here. Now I'll use my blend tool and create some duplications of this evenly and perfectly spaced. Looks like a solid yellow line. All I have to do is open the options for my blend, come down to specified steps. Currently there are 6 steps. Let's try half of that and see what it looks like. Yeah, that looks okay. I'll choose all right. Now for custom blends, or I should say for custom brushes, blends don't work with those. So we need to convert to the blend, and I have to go off the screen up here to the upper left where we have our object palette. I can come down to blends. Now you can see one of the options, and the option we're looking for is expand. So it turns the blend into actual geometry now. With this all completed, I'm going to select everything by dragging around it. I will choose now group. I will come over here to brushes, a tab that I have open, and choose new. A modal dialog box opens up and it says, well, what kind of brush do you want? The brush we want is a pattern brush, something that repeats. So I'll choose new pattern brush and select OK. I'll accept the defaults right here. There's some other things you can do for pattern brushes. Consult your documentation if you want to engage those. But this is why I smoothed all the paths out. So now that we've got this nice pattern brush, how do we apply it? Well, we'll select the road. Then I'll come up here to the pattern brush and click the pattern brush. Oh, there's our road. Awful big, awful chunky. We can change that by changing the actual stroke on the road, which is what I'm going to do, the stroke dimension. So now as you can see, we've got this great detailed road texture that we can actually customize in Photoshop if we want. We can customize it and do some fun stuff with it in Carrara painlessly, quickly. So the last step here is to export this AI document, this Illustrator document, into a texture format we can in fact use in Carrara. First I'll save this. Exported road converted AI. We'll save that to its current location. I'll save it with the defaults. We'll let it finish thinking about it. And now under File, I can export. I will export this as the exported road converted, but instead of a BMP file, I will change to a TIFF format. I'll save this as an RGB format. Carrara does not like CMYK files. I'll save it at 300 dpi, so we have high resolution. That will make this a large file. I will want to save it with anti-aliasing and LZW compression. Since I'm on a Mac, well, duh, I'm saving it in a Macintosh format. This will take just a second because it's actually a rather large file, but I can use it later for close-up shots. So that's done. It's time to come back into Carrara and put all these parts together now. I'll choose Carrara. This is where we go ahead and we come up to the import button in this window we did not close when we exported the terrain, and I'm going to choose import. We will drive over to our mountain road, and we've got our exported road TIFF. This is the one we want to import now that has our actual road pattern on it. I'll go ahead and let me make this window smaller so you can see what I'm doing. I'll choose Open That. It thinks about it for a second because this is now a higher resolution file. It's coming in at 1025 by 1025. It's been added to this. If we scroll around our scene a little bit, we should be able to see the road showing up. There it is. It's very faint, and that's perfect. Here it's a little bit darker as we get around to the edge. If we move around our terrain just a little bit here, we can kind of see it, but let's simply select OK, engage this option. It's modified the terrain. Let's go back to our assembly room here, pull the camera out a little bit, and do a quick render. Now the textures, as you know from the texture room or the tutorials if you followed that series, the terrain texturing tools are incredibly cool in Carrara, and in fact they respect some of the terrain behaviors like the flatness of the terrain. We can actually see the road coming through the very top of our terrain over here a little bit. Let me close down that. I'll go back to this room. If we let me show you the render frame so we can see exactly what we're looking at. Well, let me just do this. We'll move the whole camera over. If I go ahead and do a render again, we'll see now that we've got this terrain. We can see our road creeping around the side, and it's a nice level road. It doesn't have those strange up and downs if we had simply painted it in Carrara. Let's go back and do a couple other things. One is, let's change the texture on this terrain. That's kind of the chunky default texture that comes up with that. So I will open the browser window. In theory, we'll come over to Shaders. We'll come over to Terrain. And now I'll just pick something like complex green grass and drop it onto here. Now when we do a render, we'll see that we get a much richer texture. We can go in, we can play with the bumpness of it, you know, how rough it is, those type of things. But what we need to do is lay in our road because it's not showing up. We can see where it belongs, but the road's not there. So we'll come back in and make sure our terrain is selected. It is here. And then we'll jump into our texture room. This is where things get a little more complex because one of the tricks I'll show you with Carrara is not documented in the book here. I've got a very large render window so we can see that. Let me close it down a little bit. The terrain editor is very complex. I'm not going to explain all the intricacies of it right now, but what you do need to know is that we're going to add a new terrain element. We'll come down to this little plus symbol. We'll choose Terrain Layer. We get our typical terrain layer that pops up. Then we have the ability for distribution, and we have the ability to choose a shader. Well, for distribution, we've got our options limited to a great plug-in called Anything Goose, which isn't going to help us out from Digital Carvers Guild. We've got some others that are all terrain-based, and they, with the exception of the three at the bottom, which also come with some great plugins from Digital Carvers Guild. We really don't have an option to lay the road on the way we want to, so here's where we start getting funny. Under the shader, I'm going to choose multi-channel. And multi-channel means I can put whatever I want in there. It really doesn't care. So for clarity right now, I'm going to change the color of this to something bright red so we'll be able to see it. But you'll notice that terrain has not updated. We need to go ahead and change this distribution channel to locate where we want that to go. Well, remember how we exported that terrain alpha mask out of Photoshop? That's what we'll use here. But we don't have the ability to drop in a texture map. That's just not a choice we have there. So this is where we play games with Carrara. I'll come to the alpha mask channel right here. I'll choose terrain or texture map. I'll go ahead and select in my Mountain Road folder the exported alpha mask and choose open. And it says you're opening a TIFF file, and that's okay with me. It drops it in, but it's still not showing up here, and that's okay because what we're going to do is simply take this channel, which is a texture map channel, and drag it up into distribution. It'll give you a warning. This warning says, you can't do that. What do you think you're doing? Are you nuts? You can only drop a multi-channel or a layer list shader or a global mixer at the very top level. Well, I'm here to tell you to ignore that. Just say force drop. You force drop it. Hey, look, suddenly a road is showing up on our terrain. And one of the reasons that I am suggesting you do it this way is that it allows you to keep all of the very cool bump functions that are part of Carrara's terrain shaders. Now, it's kind of fuzzy here. This obviously isn't the road we want. For distribution here, while we fuzzed up the edges a little bit, let me move our preview. I'm going to change it from sampling to Gaussian filtering, which is going to fuzz it up a little bit more, and this will help us when we get into more sophisticated types of applications. The next step here is simply to come to the color channel, change that to texture map, drive over to the texture map we created in Adobe Illustrator. Let me drag this out so we can do it. Here's our exported road converted TIFF. I'll open it. I'll confirm the format. It's dropped that in, and now we have a detailed road going along right here. Now you may be saying, wait a minute, look at all this white. What is going on here? That's too much white. Well, we made the road much narrower than we actually made the alpha map in Photoshop. There's an intention for this, and that's that you can go in and change the color of either this texture map or how you choose to blend it together with the alpha map to natural earth tones. If I go ahead and zoom in here just a little bit, as we zoom in we can see that we've got this road in all its detail. The texture map's only 1025 by 1025, which is showing up as pixelation on the edge here. But this is how you start creating and applying roads. If I didn't want a road texture in here, instead I could go ahead and just change this to a color. We did have the bright red in there. I could change it into a gravel road in a heartbeat by going ahead and going to operators. Let's go to mixer instead. I'll change color 1 to something that's more earth tone like. We'll just option drag that down here. I'll pick something that's a little browner perhaps. And then for a blender, let's go ahead and choose, instead of simple, let's come down to noise and choose, if I can drive my mouse, let's choose noise factory. We'll scale down the actual noise to something like 6, so we're blending those two colors together. And we get the ability to go ahead and have a natural looking road really easily created across our surface. Now I've backed out twice on that. The final thing that I'll leave you with as we work on our road here is you may be going, well, what if I want to change the terrains, but I want to keep the road information? Here's how you do that. You simply go ahead and come up here to the terrain layer, collapse the terrain layer, and it says new terrain layer. Rename this thing so you know what it is. Road. There we go. That was easy. So now we're going to go ahead and copy this terrain layer by just doing the keyboard shortcuts that you do for copying. I'm going to come back to the assembly room, expand my browser palette, and let's go ahead and pick something new. Maybe instead we want, let's pick complex snowy scene, and we drop it in there. We'll go back to the shader room. We see we have a beautiful snowy landscape across our mountain road. We'll go ahead and zoom in here a little bit, and you'll be able to see where the road is because the snow is sticking to part of it. But we want the road to be clear of that, so all we do is come down to this plus symbol under the top shader for our layers list, click on it, add a terrain layer, but instead of going through everything we just went through, I'll just simply highlight the terrain layer and quickly paste in all that work we did on the earlier terrain layer. So we'll get kind of an awkward looking green road that shows up across our snowy terrain. Well, we could turn this black, we could turn it to whatever we wanted to. That is how easy it is to go ahead and add sophisticated roads while maintaining all the textural integrity of your files in Carrara 6 Pro.